Library. Good afternoon, everyone. We might begin. My name is John Roskam. I'm a Senior Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, and welcome to tonight's discussion hosted by Connor Court as part of a wonderful series of discussions about new Connor Court publications. Today we are discussing a great man and a wonderful work, Frank Knopfelmacher, Selected Writings, edited by Frank's son Andrew. It is an important and timely discussion, as it is an important and timely publication. What Frank wrote about and what he spoke to about our current condition, about the challenges of the world, of Australia, is absolutely as relevant today, sadly, as it was in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. The format for today's discussion is that Andrew is going to say a few words. Then we will have Professor Emeritus, the great John Carroll, who did a wonderful piece on Frank and the work in the Financial Review a little while ago, and John, of course, who spoke at Frank's retirement dinner. John will speak and reminisce and conclude, and then also tell us about what Frank would think of today, what he would think of 2025 Melbourne.
I'll leave that to you.
So that will be about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion, and then we'll finish around 7 o'clock or so. Cass is here. Christmas is coming up. For those of you who haven't already got Selected Writings, you can buy a copy here. You can buy copies of other Connor Court works. I just want to acknowledge before we begin Brian Loughnane, who was here and who reminded me that he was in this room when the work was launched by Peter Costello, and Alex McDermott, a great historian. And Alex, for those of you who are IPA members and supporters, wrote about selected works in the latest edition of Essays for Australia. If you're an IPA member, you will have received it. If you're not, you can access it soon for free on the World Wide Web. So thank you so much for being with us, Andrew. What you've done is incredible, it's necessary. Can I ask you to talk about the work?
Yes. Thank you, John, with pleasure. Yes, thank you all for coming here tonight. Thank you, John, for organising it, Anthony Capello of Connor Court and Professor Carroll being here tonight. And I just want to say about my father, who's in whose honour this gatherings are taking place tonight. One thing, amazing thing, is it can't be emphasised strongly enough the contemporary relevance of his writings. Now, my father, in so many ways, I was discussing this with my mother Sue recently, he had a crystal ball. He really did. Not only in regard to the totalitarian threat to human civilization, but also in regards to potentially and actually the harmful social consequences of many political policies and actions in Western societies as well. And all actions have consequences, both intended and unintended. That he couldn't emphasise strongly enough, as one of his great intellectual guides, Max Weber, pointed out. And whether it's speaking about multiculturalism, which he emphasised, not because he was against peace and harmony between ethnic groups, but on the contrary, because he was all for peace and harmony between ethnic groups, he came out against many of the policies of multiculturalism. And with what's happening in the world now, with the confrontations with China and Russia, and as we know, President Putin is an absolute product of the former Soviet system. So everything now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all the tensions with China in our region, they all hark back to the original template for all Marxist-Leninist regimes, which was the former Soviet Union. Russia in 1917. That was the first Marxist-Leninist totalitarian state in history. And these problems are still with us today. And about my father's personal style, both with the spoken and the written word.
Let me get the share.
As Winston Churchill said in relation to Harry Hopkins, he said, "Harry, you are Lord Root of the matter." With the spoken and written word, that's a very good way of describing my father. He was always straight to the point, and he educated, as he said, he helped to educate 2 generations of Australians concerning many of the most pressing political and social problems and controversies of the day, many of which unfortunately still affect us now as we speak, like as I said. Now, as a participant, observer and rare survivor of many of the 20th century's worst catastrophes, he always said he felt he had one duty, and that is to warn. To warn. So, in relation to this book, please read and listen to and take in what this insightful man had to say and heed his warnings, which we all ignore at our own peril. That's what I would like to say. Thank you.
Before we hear from John, I failed in my duties at the beginning of the introduction to welcome Sue Knopfelmacher. Sue, thank you for being with us. John.
Thank you. You can all hear me at the back? Yeah, okay. I knew Frank over sort of 20 or so years, from the mid-70s to 95. I often I knew him pretty well. I was never a student of his, for better and for worse maybe. He was a rather intimidating presence. I met him often at Melbourne University at afternoon coffee, morning coffee in the staff rooms. He loved conversation and socialising. I met him at quadrant dinners, I met him in seminars. We sort of interacted backwards and forwards over the years. I thought then, and this is only increased with time, reinforced by this book, that this country's, and this is a radical statement, has produced one political philosopher analyst of the first rank in world terms, and that's Frank Knopfelmacher. And I want to briefly here try to justify that claim. Frank was an extraordinary presence. Being in universities around the world, I've never met anyone like him. He was a fearless truth sayer with a persona that did not allow anyone to escape his presence. And in a time, in universities particularly, but in the wider culture, which is completely dominated by trendy left-wing opinions, ideology, people who are sort of identity politics, people scrambling for cover all the time, wondering what was the right or the virtuous opinion. He was a beacon of light that this is not the intellectual's vocation. This is not how you do it. You do it by ruthlessly and fearlessly pursuing the truth, whatever the consequences. Now, he was in an era at Melbourne University, and some of you will be familiar with this, when there were other significant presences, which is not the case today. And this is another issue, but since about I know the universities well, since about the 1990s, very few of the best and brightest in our society have gone in to become university staff. And as a result, the quality of the university staff has deteriorated very, very significantly from Frank's era. But I just think of one example which is quite comic in relationship to Frank. And by the way, my first encounter with Frank Knopfelmacher was as an 19-year-old doing Psychology 1 at Melbourne University. He was in the psychology department. He was at the time a committed behaviourist, and he came in to give one lecture to Psychology 1, and it was utterly boring. Anyone who knows Frank would hardly believe that. He obviously didn't believe in what he was saying, which was the sort of rat and pigeons, phony scientism of psychology at the time, and he very soon left that. But that was my first Knopfelmacher encounter. He was at Melbourne University at the same time that Professor A.F. Davies was Professor of Politics. I don't know if any of you, Alan Davies, Fu Davies, was a very strong presence, all of his own, quite different and almost totally opposite personality to Frank. Now, Alan Davies' one passion was Freudian psychology, and in particular psychobiography. So, you know, it was just eye-bogglingly contradictory that Alan Davies was Professor of Politics when he should have been in psychology, and Frank was in psychology when he obviously should have been in politics. I want to take up two, just in order to try and suggest the sort of power of Frank's ideas, two of his themes which come out in the book. The first, and utter relevance today, the first is an observation in 1967, at the time of the Israeli-Arab War, the Six-Day War, which Israel won comprehensively. And three countries, Egypt, Syria, Jordan surrounding it, attacked at the same time and basically wanted to obliterate it, wipe it out. Israel won the Six-Day War. Frank's observation, this is 1967, this is nearly 60 years ago, was that now things have utterly changed for the Jews. Jews were the pets of the left. They were looked upon with condescending pity by the left in Western politics, and as the underdogs, ones we could condescend to, ones we could look after. Now the Jews had done the one indescribable, impossible thing in the Six-Day War. They had won. And at that point, as victors, on the side of, and this is extraordinary, this is 1967, this is extraordinary. Frank realised that the left, the Western left, almost entirely would switch against the Jews. And in the last 2 years, it's only in the last 2 years we've seen the full bent of the power of Frank Knopfelmacher's prediction in 1967. He understood intuitively the massacre. I've spent a lot of my working life trying to understand the masochism of the left and what is underneath this extraordinary hatred of its own country, the sort of cultural self-hatred which generates the sort of passions that we've seen in the Free Palestine movement in the last 2 years. This has come in waves. It didn't start in the 1960s. George Orwell, in I think it was 1944, observed in Partisan Review, and George Orwell on the left, a socialist, observed virtually the entire British left intelligentsia was actually secretly happy whenever Hitler won a battle. Was secretly happy whenever Hitler won a battle. So this is in the 1940s already. We've got this sort of extraordinary cultural masochism, for want of a better word, which, I mean, we can happily talk about this. I've been trying to write about it for years and years, unsatisfactorily, of what's underneath this. It comes back in the 1960s, Frank observing 1973, almost the entire Western intelligentsia thinks Ho Chi Minh is a hero. Yeah. Now this is a sort of totalitarian monster, basically. They all think Mao Zedong is leading us into the promised land. Mao Zedong, who we now know murdered something like, or was responsible for the death of something like 60 million Chinese. Now this, and the last 2 years, we've seen this yet again with the extraordinary support for Hamas in the Western left intelligentsia. Frank doesn't, at least as I'm familiar, doesn't go into any great depth into the sort of psychology of this left masochism, for want of a better way of describing it. There have been psychoanalytical theories, Louis Foyer in Canada. There've been, I suspect it's got a lot to do with the fact that in eras of hardship, which were the Great Depression, the two world wars, the parents of the 1960s generation, by and large, whatever all said, didn't have time to theorise about the meaning of life. They were just they were struggling to survive. Once you take the struggle to survive away, once you take hardship away, as we did in the West from the 1950s onward, with this extraordinary success and prosperity, then what's the meaning of my life comes to the forefront. And in an age which is no longer Christian, and hardly anyone is Christian in any serious existential sense anymore, and they haven't been since the 1960s. I mean, 5% of Australians go to church regularly. It's negligible. So Christianity has not been answering, for almost everyone, has not been answering the big questions of meaning. Some turned to Buddhism and Hinduism as some sort of alternative, which it's not me, but I have some sympathy for that, of finding some sort of meditative tranquility, some connection with the beyond in alternative religions. But a lot turned to what one might call redemptive politics, the belief that you can find redemption through politics. Now, by the 1960s and thereafter, this is extraordinary given Western history. I mean, the first half of the 20th century is an absolute lesson in the disaster of redemptive politics. We had it in Germany with Hitler, and Nazism is going to produce a new millennium, a Third Reich, which is going to last forever, and it's going to transform it's going to give them metaphysical meaning and dignity. We had exactly the same with communism on the left, the sort of redemptive politics of the belief in the sort of transformation that would come. And George Orwell, there's a lot of things to be said in favour of George Orwell, and Frank was a great admirer of him. But there's a lot of negative about George Orwell. He's sort of bought into the leftist dream of redemption through politics. He was a very strange mixed character at that level. So Frank's insight that the Western left would turn against the Jews. He doesn't include the anti-Semitism that's risen in the last 2 years, because I think that just wasn't coming. But that's another nasty ingredient that we've now got in front of us. But this prescience in the left, I mean, he understood the left already then. It will turn against the Jews. My second example, very pertinent to Australia too, is his Anglomorph, his creation of the term the Anglomorph world. His own experience as a Czech, being an exile twice from Czechoslovakia, first fleeing the Nazis, second fleeing the communists, brought him, and going to England and loving England. I mean, he loved England and he loved Australia, not the United States, which is maybe worth some discussion. Solly puzzles me, his response to the United States. But he came to the view, and this is, probably the shrewdest political philosopher I've ever come across. He came to the view that the English had created a set of robust institutions based on skills, based on tradition, and based on institutional knowledge, which would withstand. The English had created a set of a culture and institutions which would withstand the upheavals of the modern world in a way that continental cultures didn't. This was a huge distinction. And of course, the crowning example of this was, should we be thankful to England? His response, we owe them everything. They stopped Hitler in 1940. And if the English hadn't stopped Hitler in 1940, one of my own, this is one of her favourite Knopfelmacher anecdotes, was on sabbatical leave in London. Some of you may know this. He's walking around the suburbs of London. I remember he came back and he told me, he pulled out of his pocket, he had a photograph of Hitler. He said he was walking around the suburbs of London. He said, I had to keep pulling this photo of Hitler out of my pocket to remind myself that these were the people that beat Hitler. Now, many of this is, in other words, in his perception, there was a particular quality, there's a particular political nous deep in the English, which is if you walk around the suburbs of London, you won't see it, just as you walk around East Melbourne or Hawthorne or wherever you live in Melbourne, you won't see it. But I was reminded of this, many of you seen the film The Darkest Hour, about Churchill in 1940, the time when everything is going terribly. The army's stuck in France, looks like it's going to be captured or killed. This is before the escape from Dunkirk. Churchill's being pressured by his cabinet to negotiate with Hitler, and especially by Lord Halifax. He's under huge pressure, and he's worried. He's sort of tempted. He's almost thinking, I've got no alternative. And if I remember rightly, it's his wife. Is it his wife who tells him, "Go and ask the people"? Anyway, whoever does, he himself goes down into the underground in London. Yes, it's the strongest scene in the whole film. Goes into the train, starts chatting. Everyone's going, "Well, this is Churchill." Starts chatting to everybody, and then he asks them basically, what should we do? Should we negotiate with the Germans or should we resist? And he gets this huge explosion from ordinary English men and women in the train. He gets this huge explosion. No, resist to the death. Resist to the death. And seeing this reminded me of Frank's observation about the sort of the English tradition and how I mean, he was, as Andrew was saying, he was hostile to multiculturalism, not to having lots of people coming in, but he was hostile to multiculturalism because there was always a slight risk that it would weaken the Anglo-morph stability of the particular society in which we live, and take away or dilute the sort of strengths that we depend upon. And we've got a war going, especially in Melbourne, we've got a war going on at present. It's sort of maybe war's over-dramatising it, but we certainly got a lot of violence, a lot of conflict going on around us at this point, when it's almost as if the Knopfelmacher equation is sort of in question. In the English case, which was different, he basically saw Middle England as going out to the countryside into small towns and villages, and that would preserve the sort of Anglo-morph culture from the cities, which were much more multiculturalism. Australia's not like that. We all live in cities. So, I mean, I think that's one of our open questions here of what Frank might say. But his Anglomorph, his term, the Anglomorph, was very, very strong reminder that the pieties of multiculturalism, beware of them. I want to finish by switching to a film, Ladies in Black. I don't know if any of you saw a Bruce Beresford film from 7 years ago, when it's typically tender, nostalgic Bruce Beresford film, strongly recommended. He sets it in 1959 Sydney, and basically there's a contrast between the old Australia in 1959 Sydney, which is sort of naive, almost primitive. It's represented by young women working in a department store and their experience and their views of the world. They're honest. They're very naive, they're sort of very, very unworldly, and they come into contact with a group of Central European immigrants into Sydney, who are bringing with them Mozart and European culture, and the film is, in a way, is a celebration of the fusion or the synergy that happens then between the sort of naive, honest, simple, old world Australia, 1959 Sydney, and the influx of cosmopolitan European values. Now, I think, looking back at Melbourne University, Frank in these terms is bringing to Melbourne University, Melbourne, Australia, similar sort of, obviously quite different from department store girls, but Central European culture, which then is permeating through, to some degree, a lot of students, people who came under his influence. And the best of Australian culture, as we've seen it created by the baby boomers and those people who have come after, the best of Australian culture is a sort of synergy of the old, simple, honest, Aussie and the modern world, probably at its best in the intellectual sense, represented by Frank Knopfelmacher. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Before I open it up to questions, let me take the opportunity to ask John and Andrew some questions. I never met Frank, but I did go to one of his lectures at Melbourne University. So this would have been 1985, 86, something like that. And a friend of mine from university, Scott Hargraves, who followed me as executive director of the IPA currently, we were talking about our subjects, and I was doing law commerce, and that was boring. And he said he's got this amazing lecturer in psycho-social, cultural, political history, something, and he said, come along. And the lecture theatre was literally full. I reckon only about a third of the people in the lecture theatre were actually doing the subject. And I remember Frank in the first couple of sentences said Hitler, Hannah Arendt and Freud, and then he gave a wonderful exposition about something to do with Middle European history, and I can't remember what he said, but I can just remember his energy and his enthusiasm for the subject. So that is a precursor to ask you, what was he like? Tell me. So I'm going to say, what was he? Well, it's difficult to, I suppose, ask what was he like as a dad, what was he like around the kitchen table. But you reading, and then I'll ask John, what was he like as a friend, as a colleague? Because reading this and his experiences growing up in the Second World War and then Israel, he was incredibly serious and thoughtful. But it struck me that he would always see. I don't know whether he did have a sense of humour, so I'm going to ask you that. But he could see there was a point to the rest of it. Would he talk about other things, or was it always Freud and Weber at the dinner table?
Let me put it this way: no one had a more highly developed sense of the comic than my father, but there was also no one who took life more seriously than Frank Knopfelmacher. Yes. He had a great wit and a great sense of irony, but at the same time, like I say, no one took life more seriously.
Did they go together?
They did, actually. They complement each other. When I was young, growing up, and I was a naive little boy or whatever, I thought, God, Daddy's so nice. God, he knows everything. It's a bit intimidating. But he knows everything. He makes jokes. He just knows about everything. I don't know where to start. The world's such a complicated place. There's Lenin's theory of revolution, for instance. In a nutshell, Lenin said consciousness has to be brought to the masses from without. The masses are too ignorant, too whatever, too silly, too drunk, just too exhausted, or have their judgment clouded by superstition. Lenin was corrupted by Hegel. He believed their consciousness has to be metaphysically brought to them from without. Like, for instance, yes. I also say, my father, he absolutely loved teaching and loved lecturing. One of the things he actually held against so many of his colleagues in the arts faculties is he thought they weren't really interested in their vocation. They weren't interested in what they're teaching. He said, the fact that it's interesting, my colleagues, they all complain about the amount of teaching they have to do. It's very interesting. They think they are burdened with having to teach too much, and it distraction from their true vocation which is what they call research. They have to teach, and it's impeded by what they really want to do, which they say is research.
Well, it's interesting, and I don't know whether you've deliberately selected essays to cover this, but you get the impression he thought teaching was the most important because that's when you can get to the young minds.
Yes.
That's when you can influence them. It's not researching books and articles that no one will read. It's getting to young people.
Yes.
and then stacking Labor Party branch meetings
No.
and student association meetings, which I'll ask you about in a moment.
Yes.
John, what was he like as a colleague and friend?
Very hard to describe, and I've never thought of how to articulate this, but his presence was sort of self-contained, opposite, face full on and athwart, as Les Murray once said to me, not about Frank. Looking straight at you, speaking very slowly with an accent, clearly going through thoughts that had been coming to him. But at the same time, there's a sort of detachment in this. There's a sort of distance and detachment. But at the same time, there was a sort of warmth, and there was a personal warm element in his contact with you. He was pleased to see you. So there's this very strange, almost contradiction between the personal, Frank, and the fact that his persona was there, like in his essays or in his lectures, producing the argument, the saying, whatever it was that had come to his mind, and it was quite unique. I've never known anyone at all like him. I mean, I've known university professors and teachers who were fearlessly truth sayers and truth pursuers, like Frank. My doctoral supervisor in Cambridge, George Steiner, was like that.
Yes.
But he did not have the personal. He was personal in a very, very different way. He's actually, in a sense, more normally personable than Frank Knopfelmacher was. There was nothing normal about Frank at all.
Can I then ask you about the searing truth that he would write about? I mean, he would be difficult for a head of department, difficult for a head of faculty, because he would always call it as it was. He was always honest and brave, regardless of the consequences. How did his colleagues, well, to both of you, how did his colleagues and his friends relate to that?
Well, when he got to the Melbourne Uni Psych Department in 1955, he was absolutely shocked and dismayed to find that there were absolutely hardline dogmatic Stalinists in his department who were pushing the biological wisdom of Comrade Lysenko, Stalin's favourite biologist. His father always referred to the charlatan murderer Lysenko. He said he was really taken aback. He said they were more dogmatically and reactionary Stalinists than the communists he knew in Prague from 1946 to 1948. That startled him. And he said, do I piss off or do I stay and fight?
And he stayed and fought.
Stayed and fought, yes.
How many of them were like that?
Well, he didn't think it was so much, it wasn't so much the quantity, but the quality. He said the people, they had a kind of like, pretty much a hegemonial control over the department, as he said. He said he just basically wanted to teach at the time what was the common, boring, American bullshit, as he put it, that learning theory, but that was being denounced as being a bourgeois science by some of his Stalinist colleagues.
Were his colleagues jealous?
Jealousy, I think.
Envious?
Some of them, maybe some of them were. He said envy is
very limited.
they're limited, and he said envy is quite a common Australian. He thought Australians have a tendency towards envy a lot, but he didn't think that so much in regard to his colleagues in the department. He thought many of his colleagues, the Stalinists and fellow travellers among them, just genuinely hated him for being a passionate, militant anti-communist, but also an intelligent.
And how did he deal? Again, you read the essays and you think of him as a brave outsider with loyal followers, but the system was working against him, and it strikes you he must have been a very gifted, which he was, academic and teacher to have lasted and not to have been knocked off. So how did he deal with the attitudes of his colleagues who were so often hostile, given that so often he was in a minority of one?
Yes, it's true. And look, I don't want to give the impression that he was always totally hostile to all his colleagues. Some of his colleagues, believe it or not, he got on with surprisingly well, including one or two of his colleagues who were one time or other members of the Communist Party and still had sympathy for them. For the party.
There were
John,
other,
how did he manage?
Well, there were other people. The university was different then. There were strong persons in the English department. I think there's Finn Buckley, who was close to Frank, and there was a range of actually really gifted. There was Peter Steele, there was Chris Wallace Crabb, the poet, in English. There was Alan Davies with his Freudian psychobiography, not politicised at all in politics. So the university was less sort of coherent. There was less a hegemony of left totalitarian thought in those days. So someone like Frank, I think it was freer to move wherever he wanted to move in that time. I mean, he obviously tried to go to Sydney and he got knocked back by a communist putsch basically there, thankfully for Melbourne. So it was easy. It was easier. There was more a sense of, and this is I'm talking from the perspective of students. There was more of a perspective of going to university and finding people who were powerful teachers and powerful presences, and sort of people you could actually learn from and identify with then, than in the subsequent humanities faculties.
He got very well some people in the philosophy department when he arrived at Melbourne. He was a pansy right.
He was chemistry.
Oh, chemistry. Anyway, he got along with very well some people in the philosophy department. They saw him as being... Oh, another thing, the great intellectual academic of my father's life was philosophy. Not just applying philosophical analysis to other academic disciplines and to political and social problems, but pure philosophy. Philosophy is a subject. And many of them saw him as being a very gifted philosopher who was unfortunately burdened with a number of, as they saw, political eccentricities. And eventually, although the philosophy department, as he pointed out, Bertrand Russell of all people during his visit to Melbourne said it's the best run philosophy department, academic philosophy department he'd ever seen anywhere in the world. And Bertrand Russell wasn't one to hand out cheap flattery by any means.
So 2 final questions from me and then questions and comments. Could any university, Melbourne, La Trobe, Sydney, accommodate a Frank Knopfelmacher today? John?
Very unlikely. Very, very... he wouldn't get appointed.
No,
He wouldn't get appointed.
And final question from me before questions. This is the game. What would Orwell say? What would Churchill do? What would Frank have said? What would Frank be saying to us in Melbourne in 2025? To both of you, John.
Well, he'd be stressing the Anglo-morph, and especially with the... I mean, he was predicting the danger with multiculturalism is that the society fragments into a series of ethnic enclaves, which become more and more hostile to each other. And so you lose social coherence and social cohesion, and he'd be saying the same things about the left, probably multiplied by 2 or 3, about the.
How would he say we get through this? Well, actually, I'll go back. Was he optimistic?
By nature, no. By nature, he was a guarded pessimist, I'd have to say.
He was a realist.
He was a realist. He was an absolute realist. Politically, he was an absolute realist. And he was not a dogmatic party line tolerant of any kind. He didn't agree with the right in inverted commas, or the conservative and the libertarian right often. His views were always his own, yes. What would he think? And
So
he
how would he get us through this period?
Well, I think he'd get... well, this is me speaking rather than him, because I can't... His view about the success of Australian multiculturalism was based on benign neglect.
Yes.
That basically people came, they came from anywhere and everywhere, and they slowly or quickly learned, this is actually a much better country than the one I've come from. I like it here. So I think at that point, extrapolating, he would basically say, and I've had Jewish friends in the last 2 years, they said, what can we do? Do we teach more about the Holocaust? Do we do? And I basically said to them, I don't think there's anything you can do. You can just hope that the good sense of middle Australia, the good sense of the average Australians, this has always been the case, will rise to the fore, and the sort of the noisy insects of the hour, however, I mean, there are more today than there were in the 1960s. The noisy insects of the hour will go their own way. So the optimistic reading, and this is following Frank, is that, you know, just let the good sense of middle Australia, just hope that it's not going to be too damaged by what's happening currently.
Questions, comments? Please.
Yep.
I ask you to thank Andrew and thank John. Thank you for the support of Connor Court, and copies of selected writings are available from Cass, as are other works. See you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.